What up, muchias? I'm back from traveling and being sick at the same time. Don't worry, I haven't forgot about this series, so this will be our conclusion. So starting with the art, big picture stuff, Edge of the Mist is about the only one that actually looks like it's in the mist, whereas the other ones could be any random place in Tyria. So this could be somewhere in Kynesdale, this could be where the Norns are, and this could be somewhere in between the Silver Waste and Maguma. Edge of the Mist gets a lot of hate. It's the only one that really has an idea of what it is when it comes to their art. The other ones, I could almost skin graft this back into Tyria itself. Well, that big picture just merely confirms what we see in first person or third person view. As you can see in Alpine, it's actually fairly flat overall. Not only that, it seems textures are still in 2014 as far as Alpine and Eternal Battlegrounds goes. Those two maps do at least have some objectives that have very drastic elevations, such as FSMC or the Hills Keep. But even getting into the newer maps, such as Desert Borderlands, we still don't get a sense that this place is actually in the mist. Again, it can be any random place in Tyria that can slot these maps, and we would never really know. At the very least, the Desert Borderlands has somewhat more updated textures and some elevation variety, perhaps anticipating gliding. That's a little bit of conspiracy or speculation. Otherwise, visually, it is more updated, for better or worse. Lastly, we have Edge of the Mist, and here we see those floating islands that are pretty much signature to the mist itself. For the details, you have the previous videos that go into it more on the art. Now you're probably wondering, why is this even important if you only care about the gameplay? Well, you're right, it's not really about the gameplay, but it's very important about the look. In short, the look, or the appeal, is what actually gets you to buy into this. It's the gameplay that keeps you playing, or forces you to refund. And yes, this look or appeal applies to actual game mechanics. If it doesn't look like it'll be fun, people aren't going to buy into it anyway. And here's just an example of how look and appeal matters to the gameplay. I'll let you watch this whole thing, and you'll have to answer, would this actually attract new players to World vs. World? And here's another extreme example. Does this particle lag-ridden spam fest actually look appealing to any new player? Now, obviously that's probably a biased question, but my answers are basically no and no. The gameplay could be engaging however you feel about whatever situation, but just based on looks and appeal, it's going to be really hard to persuade new players to get into World vs. World because of this. Starting with Alpine and EBG, they're the original maps of this game. They don't feature as heavily as this, but essentially, supply camps operate in some particular special way, towers operate in some particular special way, and keeps operate in some particular special way. Keeps, as far as Alpine goes, and Eternal Battlegrounds, essentially have the same lord, the same NPCs, the same mechanics, and same with the towers. They all have the same lord, same mechanics, same with the supply camps, and even on EBG it's the same deal. Towers are all operating in a consistent manner. Once EOT were introduced, it sort of broke the mold. While there are some towers that more or less have the same or similar mechanics, same with the keeps, all over the place it's littered with unique little objectives that have their own different take on their mechanics. So up here you might have, like, I believe this is a sentry post where you can throw down sentries and see people on the map. And down here you got some weird wormhole that takes you up here. So all over the place there's weird little mechanics that are completely different and unique, thus lending itself to be more PvE, but really it's more accurate to say it's more like a theme park than it is a competitive map where you need some consistency. You can also argue this was also carried over into Desert Borderland. Lava Keep has its different mechanics, different lore, different NPCs, same with the Garrison, and same with the Wind Keep. There's certainly an argument to be made that this is probably unnecessary complexity, considering combat in this game is already fairly nuanced. This isn't the only issue. There's a certain effect that happens in these particular maps due to having 1v1v1. And I'm going to just call this the donut effect. Essentially, what happens is you have a wheel or donut that happens for all the maps. While in a previous video I did praise that objectives were sharing significance in strategy or, say, supply for supply camps, they all are essentially linked in a wheel, with a void in the center. For Desert Borderlands and Alpine, you obviously can see that the bloodlust nodes are pretty much inactive for most of the map, and thus we have our hole in the donut. As far as EBG goes, if there aren't 3 teams actively sieging, more or less only the front towers get flipped, whereas SMC sometimes just ends up being T3 most of the time, and no one actually goes into it. And of course you have Edge of Mist that fully embraced this idea of the donut, where there's literally nothing of value in the center, but then you have linked in the donut a bunch of objectives. And sometimes they go out of their way to attack the keep. Basically, my theory is, because of map design, K-trains exist. It's not necessarily because of paper objectives or anything like that, but the idea that if there's anything more than 2 teams combating each other, you will get this effect. So why do I think this? Well, it's my belief there's only really one viable option for a 3-way. I'm not saying that Eternal Battlegrounds is great, but essentially it comes down to the equilateral triangle. And that is to say that all the angles and all the sides are the same. Not necessarily that its drawing is accurate, but essentially EBG is an equilateral triangle when it comes to that layout of the teams. Same with Edge of the Mist. This gives that map symmetry. However, when you come over to the home Borderlands, this includes Alpine as well, we don't have an equilateral triangle. And what that ends up doing, we actually have a lot of wasted space in the top and left and right corners. This is true of Alpine Borderlands, as I stated in an earlier video. This is probably because, for whatever reason, ANET felt they needed to fill the whole map, even though most of the activity happens within just this triangle. So that means we're in a tricky dilemma. They need to add a map, as people sometimes request, but if they add a map, it'll be the same Borderlands setup as before for the sake of balance. That meaning, the top, left, and right corners will have this strategically insignificant or mostly waste of space, assuming they try to fill in the whole box. So why did they get themselves into this situation in the first place? Well, as I said, there's only really one viable option for a 3-way. And that's the equilateral triangle. However, for variation's sake and hype, in order to sell their game with their competitor, probably Skyrim at the time, they need to add other maps. However, at the same time of that, they need to be balanced. So they had to copy the maps 3 times, because each one will change the position of the teams. So you have 3 of these Alpine Borderlands, or 3 of these Desert Borderland maps. And thus, we end up in a situation of, well, now it's very stagnant because there's a bunch of repeated maps. Even if your position has changed a little bit, it's essentially more or less the same. All this leads me to believe that map designing for a 3-way is just going down a rabbit hole. So it wouldn't be really surprising if we never saw a new map. Now, I can understand why you might not agree with that or be against that so far, but let's take a look at an older game. So these are some maps from StarCraft the original, and just count how many maps there are for 2 teams and how many maps there are for 3 teams. You'll notice that for the 3 teams, I already marked out what the general shapes are, and you see that for most of them they were just an equilateral triangle. The 2 teams one has a little more variation. And this merely goes to show and support my theory that there's only really one viable map design for 3-team setups. Even though in the top left one you see that there is a donut going on, but I think that's something you want to avoid because you end up hampering down to only 2 pathways for each team instead of 3 pathways for, say, an equilateral triangle. Another unfortunate thing that happened for the home Borderlands, they had to be significantly changed in map design, particularly all the changes that have happened in the center of the map. And of course, as you know now, there's bloodlust nodes, and it can be very inactive towards the center. And thus, we have the donut effect on both of those maps. Alright, so we do have to talk about something. The elephant in the room. Regardless of what you feel about my previous opinions, we have to talk about the lag. Right now, if you actually get into a 3-way, this happens on every reset night, the game simply lags and becomes nearly unplayable. However, if the map designs were just 2 teams, I believe this would be significantly reduced, as 2 teams currently don't cause as much lag as 3 teams do. And the problem is, ANET doesn't have the budget to switch the entire game mode over into just 2 teams. I mean, that would be a massive amount of money, and there's no way to actually guarantee there'd be sales for such things, which is why I have to conclude Map design for World vs. World is just one big old giant rabbit hole. Of course, because I'm no sissy, I'm going to try my own hand at map design, but for me, I'm just going to be doing two-way because three-way would just actually be a waste of my own time because of the issues I've already described. Now, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you hate this video and hate my guts and don't like it at all, hit that dislike button. If you want to be updated on more on upcoming videos, subscribe, tap that bell. Otherwise, I will see you next time.